I've been driving trucks for nearly 20 years, hauling goods from coast to coast, through snowstorms, desert heat, and everything in between. It's a life I chose because it lets me stay on the road, away from the noise and troubles of the world. There's something about the steady hum of the engine and the open road that I find comforting. But this story I'm about to tell, it's one that still chills me to my bones. It started on a cold, cloudy night in October. Work had been slow for me lately, and I was taking jobs wherever I could find them. I got a call from a dispatcher I didn't know, a guy named Red. He offered me a well-paying haul that I couldn't refuse, even if it sounded a bit unusual. "Mark," Red said over the phone, "there's a load waiting in a place called Summit Bend, small town, off the map. You won't find it on GPS, but I'll send you the directions." I was used to odd places, but Summit Bend was different. When I looked for it, I found nothing. No mention of it on my map or my phone, but the pay was good, so I took the job. "Get there before sundown," Red had said, his voice serious. "Load will be ready for you." After hours of driving through winding roads and dense forests, I finally found Summit Bend. It was a ghost town. Most of the houses were empty, and the few people I saw didn't look like they'd seen a stranger in years. They watched me pass by with blank eyes, as if they were too tired to care. I followed Red's directions and found myself in front of an old warehouse, the kind that looked like it had been abandoned a long time ago. But it was the only building with lights on. A man stepped out of the shadows as I parked my truck. He was thin and gaunt, his skin pale, with deep bags under his eyes. His clothes looked old and worn, like he'd been living in them for a while. "You Mark?" he asked in a low voice. "Yeah," I said, keeping my tone steady. "I'm here for a haul." The man nodded and motioned for me to follow him inside the warehouse. The place was dark and filled with the smell of damp wood and old metal. Rows of rusted machinery lined the walls, and there were boxes stacked high, covered in dust. In the middle of the warehouse was a single large crate, about 6 feet tall and almost as wide. It was sealed tight with thick chains and metal locks. "That's it," the man said. "Take it and don't ask questions." The crate was silent, but there was a heaviness in the air around it, like the crate itself was watching me. I shook off the feeling, reminding myself that this was just another job, just cargo. I'd hauled stranger things before, though maybe not as eerie. "Any special instructions?" I asked, trying to keep things professional. The man's face tightened. "Yeah," he said, his voice low. "Whatever happens, don't open the crate, don't look inside. Just get it where it needs to go." I nodded, swallowing the unease in my throat. I'd taken weird hauls before, but this was different. Still, the pay was good, and I needed the money. I loaded the crate onto my truck, secured it in place, and set out onto the dark road out of Summit Bend. The road was empty, and the night was dark as ink. I'd driven through lonely stretches before, but this one was different. The silence was too deep, like the world itself was holding its breath. As I drove, I kept glancing at the crate in my side mirror. It sat there still and silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was inside it, watching. Around midnight, just as I was about to reach the main highway, I heard a noise. It was faint at first, a soft scratching sound, like claws against wood. I turned down the radio and listened, but the sound stopped. I shrugged it off as the wind, or maybe the road vibration, but a few minutes later, it started again, louder this time. The scratching turned into tapping, a rhythmic sound that seemed to echo through the cabin of my truck. My heart pounded as I tightened my grip on the wheel. "Just the road," I whispered to myself. "Just the road." Then, there was a loud thud from the crate, like something heavy had hit the inside of it. I felt a chill run down my spine. I'd been in this job long enough to know when something was wrong, and whatever was inside that crate was definitely not supposed to be moved. I pulled over to the side of the road, my headlights cutting through the darkness. The tapping had stopped, but the silence was even worse. I sat there, my hands gripping the wheel, my eyes fixed on the mirror. For a few moments, everything was still. I almost convinced myself that I'd imagined the noise, that the crate was just shifting from the bumps on the road. But as soon as I put my hand on the gear shift, I heard it again, scratching, tapping, and then a whisper. It was faint, almost too quiet to hear, but it was there, a low, eerie whisper coming from the crate. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound alone was enough to freeze my blood. I don't know how long I sat there, listening to that whisper. My mind was racing, trying to come up with an explanation. Maybe it was a recording, or some kind of mechanical error, I thought. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I had a choice to make. I could keep driving, pretend I hadn't heard anything, or I could break every rule in the book and open the crate. Red's words echoed in my head. Don't look inside. Just get it where it needs. Taking a deep breath, I started the engine and pulled back onto the road, telling myself to ignore the sounds. But the whispering didn't stop. It grew louder, turning into soft, raspy voices, each one overlapping with the next, like a crowd whispering in the dark. Let me out, one voice said. Help me, another voice added, softer, pleading. I tried to block out the voices, to focus on the road, but they were too loud, too insistent. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel, my knuckles turning white. This was no ordinary haul. Whatever was in that crate wasn't just cargo. It was alive, or something close to it. My name is Ray Walker, and I've been a trucker for most of my life. I started driving rigs at 22, and now at 45 I've covered almost every highway in the country. Being on the road has its challenges, but I've always liked the freedom it brings. But this story isn't about freedom. It's about a night I'd rather forget. It all started with a phone call. I'd been out of work for a few weeks, things were slow, and bills were piling up. So, when an unknown number popped up on my phone, I didn't hesitate to pick it up. Is this Ray Walker? The voice on the other end asked. It was low, almost a whisper. Yeah, that's me, I replied, unsure who was calling. My name's John. I need a trucker for a quick job tonight. Pays well. Normally, I'd ask a lot of questions before taking a job, but something in his voice sounded serious, urgent even. Besides, I needed the money. What's the cargo? I asked. Just a few boxes, he said. I'll give you a bonus if you don't open any of them. Just pick them up from our site and drop them off at the destination I'll give. It sounded shady, but I'd hauled stranger things before, and the money he was offering was more than enough to get me through the month. All right, I agreed. Where's the pickup? He gave me an address that was off the beaten path, way out in the middle of nowhere, but he promised I'd be paid in cash, no questions asked. I was supposed to meet him in an old abandoned lot by midnight. By the time I pulled up to the lot, the clock was nearing midnight. It was an eerie place, surrounded by empty fields and broken down buildings. My headlights barely cut through the darkness, and there wasn't a soul in sight. Just as I was starting to wonder if this was a bad idea, I saw a figure standing in the shadows, waving a flashlight. He wore a thick coat and a hat pulled low over his face, so I couldn't see much of him. But from the way he moved, he seemed nervous. You must be Ray, he said, his voice still low. The boxes are in the back of the shed. Load them up and I'll give you the destination. I parked my rig and followed him to an old, run-down shed on the edge of the lot. Inside, there were 5 large boxes stacked up, each one covered in dust. They looked old, worn, and each was wrapped with thick rope. What's in these? I asked, feeling a bit uneasy. Just things, John replied, avoiding eye contact. Like I said, don't open them, just load them and GGO. I hesitated, but he handed me an envelope full of cash, and I couldn't say no. I loaded the boxes onto my truck, making sure they were secure. When I was done, John handed me a slip of paper with an address scrawled on it. Drive straight there, he said. No stops, and don't look back, no matter what. Something about his words sent a chill down my spine, but I nodded. I'd been in this job long enough to know when to keep my mouth shut. With the boxes secured, I climbed into my cab, started the engine, and pulled out of the lot. As I drove away, I glanced in the mirror one last time. John was still standing there, watching me with that flashlight, until he faded into the darkness. The night was darker than usual, and the road stretched out in front of me like a black ribbon. I followed the directions on the paper, which led me to a winding, narrow highway through a thick forest. My only company was the hum of the engine and the rhythmic thud of the tires against the road. I hadn't gone far when I heard something, a soft thump coming from the back of the truck. At first, I ignored it, telling myself it was just the boxes settling. But a few minutes later, I heard it again, louder this time. It sounded like knocking. I shook my head, trying to brush it off as my imagination, but the knocking continued, steady and rhythmic, like someone tapping to get my attention. Thump, thump, thump. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something in the dark, but the back of the truck was empty, just shadows stretching across the highway behind me. "Get grip, Ray," I muttered to myself, gripping the wheel tighter. "It's just the road." I kept driving, but the knocking grew louder, turning into something that sounded like scratching. It was faint at first, just a soft, scraping sound coming from the boxes. My pulse quickened as I listened, the noise sending a chill down my spine. "Stop it," I told myself. "It's just a job. Just a job." But the scratching continued, relentless, like someone was inside those boxes, trying to claw their way out. An hour passed, and the scratching didn't let up. I tried turning on the radio to drown it out, but no station came through. Just static. I was alone, with nothing but the sound of claws scraping against wood. I took a deep breath and tried to focus on the road. But then, just as I was starting to calm down, I heard something else, a whisper. It was faint, barely audible, like a voice carried on the wind. "Help me." I froze. The voice was soft, pleading, but there was no one around. Just the dark highway and the forest stretching out on either side of the road. "Help me," the voice repeated, louder this time. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror. The boxes sat there, still and silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was inside them, something alive. "No," I whispered to myself. "It's not real. Just keep driving." I forced myself to focus on the road, ignoring the whispers, the scratching, and the faint tapping coming from the back of the truck. But the further I drove, the louder the noises grew, until it felt like they were all around me, pressing in on me from every side. And then, suddenly, everything went silent. The scratching, the whispers, the tapping, they all stopped at once, leaving me alone in the quiet of the night. I let out a shaky breath, thinking it was over. But then, from the darkness behind me, I heard a voice, clear as day. "Ray." My blood ran cold. It wasn't just a whisper, it was my name. Someone, or something, knew my name. "Ray," the voice called again, soft and haunting, as if it was coming from right inside the cab. I didn't look back. I didn't even breathe. I just kept my eyes on the road, my heart pounding as I tried to keep calm. But deep down, I knew I wasn't alone anymore. My name's Bill Travers. I've been a truck driver for over 20 years, and I've hauled every kind of cargo you can imagine. The open road is my home, and I've seen just about everything out there, or so I thought. One night changed all of that. It was late October, and I was on a delivery run from Ohio to Nebraska. The weather report had said there might be rain, but they didn't mention anything about a storm like this. By the time I crossed into Indiana, the sky was pitch black, and the rain was coming down in sheets. Thunder boomed over the horizon, and lightning lit up the road ahead in bright, jagged flashes. The wipers on my truck were going as fast as they could, but it wasn't enough. I could barely see 10 feet in front of me, and the road was starting to flood in places. I considered pulling over, but I was on a tight deadline and needed the money. Stopping wasn't an option. After a few miles of struggling through the rain, I noticed a faint glow of headlights in my rearview mirror. At first I thought it was another trucker, but as the lights got closer, I realized something was strange about them. They didn't look like regular headlights. They were too bright, almost like they were glowing. "Must be some kind of fancy new bulbs," I muttered, keeping my eyes on the road. But as the vehicle got closer, the lights didn't look right. They were too high up and spread out, and there was something odd about the way they flickered, like they were moving independently. I shook my head, blaming it on the storm. But then the lights sped up, getting closer until they were right behind my truck, lighting up the entire cabin. I glanced in the mirror, hoping to get a better look, but all I could see was a blinding glare. I sped up, trying to put some distance between us, but the lights kept pace, sticking to my bumper like glue. My hands tightened on the wheel as I tried to stay calm, but something about those lights felt wrong. Suddenly, the lights swerved to the side, as if trying to pass me. I braced myself, expecting to see some kind of strange vehicle pull up beside me, but when I looked over, there was nothing there, just empty road. "Impossible," I whispered, glancing back at the mirror. The lights were gone, just like that, vanished into thin air. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, trying to calm my racing heart. Maybe it was just my eyes playing tricks on me in the rain. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I drove for another hour, and the rain didn't let up. My fuel gauge was starting to dip, and I knew I'd have to stop soon to fill up. Luckily, a small gas station appeared on the side of the road, its old neon sign flickering in the storm. I pulled into the lot, my tires splashing through puddles as I parked beside the pump. The place looked like it had seen better days. The windows were dusty, and the lights inside were dim. There was an old pickup truck parked by the side of the building, but other than that, the place was empty. I got out of the truck, pulling my jacket tight against the rain as I made my way to the pump. The wind howled around me, and for a moment, it sounded like a whisper, like someone was calling my name. I shook it off and started fueling up, trying to ignore the eerie feeling that had settled over. Just as I was finishing, the lights inside the gas station flickered, and I noticed someone standing at the window. It was an older man, watching me with a blank expression. His eyes seemed hollow, almost empty, and he didn't move or wave, just stood there, staring. I forced a smile and nodded, but he didn't react. He just kept watching, his face half hidden in shadow. I finished pumping the gas, feeling the man's gaze on me the whole time. When I went inside to pay, the man was still standing by the window. Another man, this one younger and wearing a stained apron, stood behind the counter. He didn't look up as I approached, just muttered, $30, without even glancing at the register. I handed him the money, trying to ignore the strange vibe in the place. Rough night for a drive, huh? The man didn't answer. He just kept his eyes on the counter, avoiding my gaze. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I took my change. Thanks, I mumbled, heading for the door. Just as I was about to leave, the older man finally spoke. His voice was low and raspy, barely above a whisper. Be careful on the road, he said, his hollow eyes meeting mine for the first time. There are things out there, things you don't want to see. I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded and hurried back to my truck. As I climbed into the cab, I glanced back at the gas station. The two men were still standing there, watching me through the rain. I didn't look back as I pulled onto the road, but their words stuck with me, lingering in the back of my mind as I drove into the night. The storm showed no sign of letting up. The rain was relentless, hammering down on my truck and making it nearly impossible to see. I kept my hands tight on the wheel, my eyes straining to keep track of the road ahead. Then, out of nowhere, the lights appeared again. They were in my mirror, brighter and closer than before, almost blinding. My heart skipped a beat as I watched them, wondering if it was the same strange vehicle from earlier. This time, the lights didn't stay behind me. They moved to the side of my truck, keeping pace with me. I glanced out the window, half expecting to see a car or truck, but there was nothing there, just empty air and those strange, flickering lights. I pressed down on the gas, trying to speed up, but the lights stayed with me, hovering beside my truck like they were following me. My palms were sweaty, and my breath came in quick, shallow bursts as I tried to focus on the road. Then, just as quickly as they'd appeared, the lights vanished. I let out a shaky breath, trying to calm my racing heart, but the silence didn't last. Moments later, the lights reappeared, this time directly in front of me, blocking the road. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop as the lights hovered there, blindingly bright. My truck's engine rumbled in the quiet, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as I stared at the lights frozen in place. Then, just as suddenly, the lights moved away, disappearing into the darkness. I sat there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the night felt darker than ever. I didn't know what was going on, but one thing was clear: I wasn't alone on this road. I'm Joe Tanner, a long-haul trucker with a lot of miles behind me and a few stories that could keep you up at night. I thought I'd seen everything, but nothing prepared me for what happened on a cold November night out on Highway 217. It all started with a message from a guy named Frank. Frank ran a dispatch company I'd worked with a few times before, and he was known for passing out high-paying jobs. Most of them were a little strange or out of the way, but they paid well, and I wasn't one to ask questions. This time was no different, except it would turn out to be a job I'd never forget. Frank's message was simple: got a quick haul for you, Joe. Pays double. No questions, just pick up the load at mile marker 56, Highway 217, and take it to a drop-off in Westville. Midnight delivery. I frowned as I read the message. Mile marker 56 was in the middle of nowhere, and I'd heard stories about strange things happening out there. Some truckers wouldn't go near that stretch of road, especially at night. But I'd been through rough places before, and double pay was enough to make me ignore the rumors. I replied to Frank, "I'll take it." By 11 p.m., I was on the road, heading west. Highway 217 stretched out in front of me, a lonely ribbon of asphalt cutting through fields and forests. The night was cold, and a fog had settled over the road, thick enough to make my headlights feel useless. The miles rolled by in silence, the only sound the hum of the engine. Every now and then, I'd pass an old farmhouse or a cluster of trees, but mostly it was just empty road. It was eerie, but I told myself it was just another job. After all, I'd driven through worse. When I reached mile marker 56, I pulled off to the side of the road and parked. My headlights lit up a small clearing where a large wooden crate sat on the ground. It was old and battered, with strange symbols carved into the wood. I couldn't make out what they meant, but they looked ancient, almost tribal. I got out of the truck and walked over to the crate. There was no one around, no sign of Frank or anyone else. Just that crate, waiting for me in the dark. I shivered, feeling a chill that wasn't from the cold. I shook off the feeling and grabbed the crate, hauling it into the back of my rig. It was heavy, and as I lifted it, I thought I heard something shift inside. It was probably just the contents settling, but it sounded strange, almost like a soft thud, like something moving. "Get a grip, Joe," I muttered, securing the crate. "It's just a job." Once the crate was loaded, I climbed back into the cab, checked my mirrors, and pulled back onto the highway. The fog was getting thicker, swirling around the truck in ghostly tendrils. I turned up the radio to drown out the quiet, but all I got was Great, I thought. Just me, the road, and a whole lot of silence. I'd been driving for about 30 minutes when I heard it, a soft, scraping sound coming from the back of the truck. I frowned, glancing in the rearview mirror, but all I saw was darkness. The sound stopped, and I figured it was just the crate settling. But a few minutes later, it started again, louder this time. It sounded like something, or someone, was moving inside the crate, scratching against the wood. My heart started to race, but I told myself it was just my imagination. I'd been on the road too long, and the fog was playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, this time a low, muffled thump, followed by another scrape. It sounded like something was trying to get out of the crate. "Knock it off, Joe," I muttered, shaking my head. "It's just a crate, probably rats or something." I tried to ignore the noise, focusing on the road, but the sounds kept getting louder until it was impossible to pretend I wasn't hearing it. It was a steady, rhythmic thumping, like someone was pounding on the walls of the crate, trying to get my attention. I gripped the wheel, my palms sweaty, as the thumping grew louder, more desperate. I knew I should pull over and check it out, but something in the back of my mind told me not to. Something told me I didn't want to see what was inside that crate. The thumping stopped, and for a moment, everything was quiet. I let out a breath, hoping it was over, but then, in the silence, I heard a whisper, "Joe." My blood ran cold. It was faint, barely audible over the hum of the engine, but I'd heard it clear as day. Someone, or something, had whispered my name. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something in the back of the truck, but there was nothing there, just darkness. "Get a grip," I told myself, my voice shaky. "It's just the wind, or maybe the radio." But the radio was still playing static, and the whisper sounded too real to be my imagination. I forced myself to keep driving, but the silence was heavy, pressing down on me like a weight. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a flash of movement. I whipped my head around, but there was nothing there, just the empty road stretching out behind me. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. But before I could collect myself, the thumping started again, louder and more frantic than before. It sounded like something was pounding on the crate with all its strength, desperate to get out. "Enough!" I yelled, slamming on the brake. The truck lurched to a stop, and I sat there for a moment, my heart pounding as the thumping continued in the back. I knew I shouldn't open the crate, but I couldn't ignore it any longer. Whatever was in there, it wanted out, and it wasn't going to stop until I opened that door. I climbed out of the cab, grabbing a flashlight from the seat, and made my way to the back of the truck. The fog was thicker than ever, swirling around me like a living thing, and the cold seemed to seep into my bones. I reached the back of the truck and took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I might find. Then, with a trembling hand, I unlocked the door and pulled it open. The crate sat in the middle of the cargo hold, its wood scratched and splintered. as if something had been clawing at it from the inside. I took a step closer, my flashlight casting an eerie glow over the worn wood. The thumping had stopped, and everything was silent, but as I reached out to touch the crate, I heard it again, a soft, desperate whisper. "Joe, please." I froze, my heart pounding as the crate shifted, just a little, as if something was moving inside. I knew I shouldn't open it. Every instinct told me to close the door, lock it, and drive as fast as I could. But something about that voice, it sounded human, pleading. With a shaking hand, I reached out and touched the lid of the crate. My name is Mike Harlan, and I've been driving trucks up and down this country for a good 15 years. I've seen my share of weird things on the road, but nothing like what I saw that night on Route 105. It started as just another drive, but it ended up changing everything I thought I knew about the world. It was early November, and I'd been on the road for nearly 12 hours straight, hauling a load of lumber from Kansas to New Mexico. The job was routine, the kind I'd done 1,000 times before, but somewhere near the Texas border, I saw a storm rolling in from the west, dark clouds swallowing up the last bit of daylight. Just then, I got a call from my dispatcher, Eddie. His voice crackled through the speaker. "Mike, I got a detour for you," he said. "Accident on the main road, so you'll need to take Route 105. It's a bit out of the way, but it'll get you there safe." I hadn't heard of Route 105, but I didn't argue. Eddie knew his stuff, and if he said it was safe, I trusted him. "Copy that, Eddie," I replied, glancing at my map. "Route 105 it is." I took the exit for Route 105, just as the first drops of rain hit my windshield. The road was narrow and winding, cutting through thick forest and patches of empty farmland. The rain picked up, pounding on the roof of my cab as I navigated the twists and turns. After a while, I noticed something odd. I'd been driving for over an hour, but I hadn't seen another car. No houses, no gas stations, nothing but trees and fog. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight, and the road felt endless, stretching on into the dark. I started to get an uneasy feeling, like I was driving through a place that didn't want to be found. The rain had turned into a full-blown storm, and my headlights barely cut through the thick mist swirling around the road. Just then, my radio crackled to life, and a faint voice broke through the static. "Mike, can you hear Mim?" It was Eddie's voice, but it sounded strange, like he was speaking from far away. I picked up the radio, holding it close. "Yeah, I'm here, Eddie," I replied. "This route is dead empty. You sure it's the right one?" There was a long pause, followed by more static. Then his voice came through again, faint and distorted. "Mike, be careful. This road strange thing." The transmission cut off, leaving me in silence. I tried calling him back, but all I got was static. I figured it was just the storm messing with the signal, but Eddie's tone had given me chills. I gripped the wheel, my eyes fixed on the road as the rain pounded down. There was something about this place that felt wrong, like I was driving through a forgotten world, where things moved just beyond the edge of the light. After another hour, the rain finally let up, but the fog was thicker than ever. I was about to pull over and check my map when something appeared in my headlights, a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my truck skidding to a stop just a few feet from the figure. It was a woman, dressed in a thin white dress, soaked through from the rain. She was staring right at me, her eyes wide and haunted. I rolled down the window, leaning out. "Ma'am, are you all right? Need a ride?" She didn't answer. She just stood there, staring at me with those empty eyes. I felt a chill run down my spine, and for a second, I thought about just driving around her. But something in her expression stopped me. I climbed out of the truck and took a step toward her. "Ma'am." She blinked, like she was waking up from a dream. Then, without a word, she turned and started walking down the road, disappearing into the fog. "Hey, wait!" I called after her, but she was already gone, swallowed up by the mist. I stood there for a moment, my heart racing. Something about her seemed familiar, like I'd seen her before, but I couldn't place it. I got back in the truck, locking the doors as I sat there, trying to shake off the eerie feeling. As I pulled back onto the road, I glanced in the mirror and froze. She was standing right behind the truck, her face pale and lifeless in the glow of the taillights. My hands tightened on the wheel, and I pressed the gas, speeding down the road without looking back. But her image stayed with me, burned into my mind. I didn't know who she was or what she wanted, but I had a feeling she was connected to this place, and that I wasn't supposed to be here. The road twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the fog. I was starting to feel like I'd been driving in circles, passing the same trees and rocks over and over. The road was silent, empty, like a ghost highway that went on forever. Then, just as I was starting to think I'd never find my way out, the radio crackled to life again. Mike, can you hear me? It was Eddie's voice, but it sounded faint, like he was calling from 100 miles away. I'm here, Eddie, I replied, gripping the radio. This road, it's like it's never ending. I can't shake the feeling something's following me. There was a long pause, then Eddie's voice came through, soft and shaky. Mike, listen to me. If you see anything, anyone, don't stop. Keep driving. The line went dead, and I stared at the radio, my heart pounding. Eddie's voice sounded different, nervous, scared, like he knew something I didn't, and that only made me more uneasy. I kept driving, my hands tight on the wheel, my eyes fixed on the road. But no matter how far I drove, the landscape never changed. It was like I was trapped in some kind of loop, driving the same stretch of road over and over. Just then, I saw it, a faint glow in the fog, like headlights coming toward me. I squinted, trying to make out the shape, but the light was too bright, blinding me as it drew closer. I slowed down, shielding my eyes as the light got brighter and brighter, filling the cab with an intense, unnatural glow. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, the light vanished, leaving me in darkness. My heart was racing, and I could feel a cold sweat on my skin. Whatever that light was, it wasn't from any car or truck I'd ever seen. It was like something else, something that didn't belong on this road. I drove on, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. What was that light? And why did Eddie sound so scared? It was like I'd stumbled into a place where the normal rules didn't apply, a place where things that shouldn't exist came to life. The fog was so thick now that I could barely see the road. I kept my speed low, my eyes darting between the windshield and the mirrors, half expecting to see that woman again, or something worse. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure standing by the side of the road. I glanced over, my heart skipping a beat, but there was no one there, just empty fog and shadows. I kept driving, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. It was like something was out there, following me, waiting for the right moment to show itself. And then, I saw it. A shadowy figure standing in the middle of the road, blocking my path. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop just a few feet from the figure. It was the woman in white, her face pale and lifeless, her eyes staring right at me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was stare back, trapped in her gaze. My name is Bill Carter, and I've been driving trucks for nearly 20 years. I'm a simple guy who keeps his head down, does the job, and doesn't ask questions. The road is where I've always felt at home. But one night, about a year ago, that road became something I'd never expected. It was a late October night, and the weather had started to turn cold. I was wrapping up a delivery in Tennessee when I got a call from my boss, a man named Ron who'd never been one for small talk. "Bill, I need you to take on an extra run," he said in a tone that didn't leave much room for a no. "Pays double if you can get it to Louisiana by dawn." I glanced at my fuel gauge, noting I'd need to fill up soon. It was a long haul on short notice, but double pay was enough to keep me going. Besides, Ron rarely offered jobs like this. I knew it had to be important. What am I hauling?" I asked, even though the answer didn't matter. There was a pause on the other end of the line before he answered. "Just a load of old equipment, nothing unusual." I shrugged it off and agreed to the job. A paycheck was a paycheck, and I could handle a night shift on the road. But looking back, maybe I should have thought twice about it. I pulled into a deserted truck yard on the outskirts of town. The place was as silent as a graveyard, and the only light came from a single bulb hanging above the loading dock. My rig was waiting there, engine idling, trailer hitched and ready to go. I didn't see anyone around, not even a loading worker, which was unusual. As I got into the truck, I noticed a strange smell, like metal and something faintly sweet, almost like decaying flowers. It was subtle, but it made my stomach turn. I shook off the uneasy feeling, fired up the engine, and pulled onto the highway. The clock read just past midnight, and the road stretched out in front of me like a dark ribbon, barely lit by my headlights. Fog was starting to roll in, covering the ground in a thin, white layer. An hour into the drive, I noticed something odd. A low hum was coming from the back of the truck, like machinery that had been left running. I figured it was just the equipment rattling around, but as the miles rolled by, the sound got louder, almost like a whispering voice hidden under the hum. I chalked it up to exhaustion. After all, I'd been on the road for hours, but then I saw something in my side mirror, a shadow flickering at the edge of the trailer. I leaned forward, squinting, but there was nothing there. Must be the fog, I muttered to myself, shaking my head. I'd driven through fog plenty of times, but this one seemed thicker, almost like it was alive, crawling up the sides of the truck. A couple of hours later, I pulled into a small gas station to fill up. The place was practically empty, with just one guy behind the counter, a young kid who barely looked old enough to work. I grabbed a cup of coffee and made my way back to the counter, hoping to shake off the strange feeling that had been sitting in my gut since I'd picked up the load. As I paid, the kid behind the counter gave me a curious look. "You driving down?" "Yeah," I replied, not really in the mood for conversation. He looked around, as if checking to make sure no one else was listening. "Just be careful, all right? Lot of folks say that road's got a bad reputation, especially at night." I gave him a nod, though his words only made me feel more unsettled. As I headed back to my rig, I glanced at the road ahead. The fog had grown thicker, swirling around the truck like smoke. I climbed back into the cab, took a deep breath, and started the engine. Just a few more hours, I told myself. Get the load to Louisiana, and this would all be over. By now, the hum from the back of the truck had become a steady, rhythmic pulse. It was almost hypnotic, like a heartbeat echoing through the metal walls. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the road, but the sound was getting harder to ignore. Then, somewhere around mile marker 233, I heard a voice. It was faint, almost like a whisper, but clear enough to send chills down my spine. "Help me." I froze, gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. The voice was soft, pleading, and it seemed to come from the back of the truck. I told myself it was just the wind, that I'd imagined it, but as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I thought I saw something, a shadowy figure sitting in the passenger seat, staring at me with empty eyes. I blinked, and it was gone. The seat was empty, and the only sound was the hum from the trailer. I shook my head, trying to shake off the image, but deep down, I knew I hadn't imagined it. For the rest of the drive, I couldn't stop glancing at the passenger seat, half expecting to see that figure again. Every time I looked, it was empty, but the feeling of being watched never went away. By the time I reached the Louisiana state line, I was exhausted. The fog had gotten so thick I could barely see 10 feet in front of me, and the humming from the back had turned into a full-blown rumble, like something was banging on the walls of the trailer. I was about to pull over and check it out when my phone rang. It was Ron, my boss. "Bill, I got a shortcut for you," he said, his voice crackling over the line. "Take County Road 23. It'll cut an hour off your drive." I hesitated. County Road 23 was a narrow, winding road that cut through the middle of nowhere. I'd heard stories about it, truckers who said it was haunted or cursed, but I'd always brushed them off as nonsense. Still, I was desperate to finish the job and get home, so I agreed. "All right, Ron, thanks for the heads up." As I turned onto County Road 23, the fog seemed to thicken even more, swallowing up the road in a blanket of white. The hum from the back had turned into a banging sound, like something was trying to break free. I gritted my teeth, trying to block it out, but the noise was getting louder and louder. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, the shadowy figure, sitting in the passenger seat again. I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. "Who are you?" I whispered, not really expecting an answer. But then the figure spoke, its voice barely more than a whisper. "You took the wrong road." I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding as I turned to look at the figure. But there was no one there. The seat was empty, and the fog was thicker than ever, pressing in on all sides. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, but the banging from the back had turned into a full-blown pounding, like something was hammering on the walls, desperate to get out. I knew I should keep driving, but something told me I had to see what was back there. I climbed out of the cab, flashlight in hand, and made my way to the back of the trailer. The pounding stopped as soon as I reached the door. I hesitated, my hand on the latch, my heart racing as I prepared to open it. With a deep breath, I threw the door open, and what I saw inside nearly made my heart stop.